I said to her as I was leaving Kent State University to take a job in Charleston, South Carolina, teaching, that I might someday want to do what she does. So I asked her if what I should do so that I could do what she does, which is to be a teacher educator. And she gave me a list of about 3 or 4 things. It was like, you need about 3 to 5 years teaching experience. If you can get that experience at different schools or in different places, that would be great. That would look good. Then you need to, she recommended getting a master's degree in education for me, to work on some academic writing and that sort of thing. And then she said, then apply to PhD programs. And so about 6 years later, I had moved back to Ohio. I finished a master's degree in educational leadership. And I emailed her and said, Dr. Crow, I'm done with the list you gave me 6 years ago, and I would like to work on my PhD now. And she had me fill out an application, came in for an interview. All in all, I spent about 8 years in social studies classrooms. I taught psychology, history, a little bit of geography. And then I spent most of my time teaching political science and US government and economics. And then I worked on my PhD from 2008 until 2012. And after finishing my dissertation there, which was a case study of early career teachers, social studies teachers, beliefs about democracy and how those beliefs shape their teaching, I was hired here at Vanderbilt and moved to Nashville. Here I am. I distinctly remember, though, being teaching a class at Kent State as I was finishing up, and the pre-service teachers who were in that class were really on me about why I'm leaving the classroom. Why are you leaving the classroom? And I remember my reply was something along the lines of, I don't feel like I'm leaving the classroom. I feel like I'm going to a new classroom. And I realized that what I really loved wasn't just teaching history and politics. It was helping people prepare to be teachers of history, politics, and so on. So finding your passion and that sort of thing was a big deal for me.
And I think that's so neat that my classmates and I have so directly experienced that love of preparation. And I think this will get into, once we can sort of step into talking about your research and then how you led our classes and our program from the social studies side of things. But one thing I wanted to ask is, why history? Why democratic citizenship? Why is that the mode of education that you thought to step into?
Yeah, it wasn't originally. I really wanted to teach and coach. This is what students from a couple years ago told me was off-brand about me. That I was a wrestler in high school and loved the sport of wrestling, and all I really wanted to do was coach wrestling. And so, I mean, the idea of history was great. I love museums. I thought history was cool. I liked the History Channel. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I at that point had no real commitment to sort of the concepts and ideas that I do now. But through education and learning and experience, of course, mentorship, those ideas manifested more clearly for me about what I did like about learning and teaching in history and political science, especially. One of the things that stood out to me in my PhD program was I started with this intention that I was going to, research technology. For some reason, instructional technology was something I thought, I don't know why. I had gotten a smart board and I thought, everyone should have smart boards. I didn't really know what I was doing. And so I did this. I remember doing my first academic presentation on instructional technology. It was a 15-minute presentation at a local conference, Ohio Social Studies Council conference, and I put together about 88 slides that I hoped to get through in 15 minutes, which was ridiculous. And I remember partway through just feeling like, this is not what I care about. I don't understand why I'm talking about Google Earth for 20 minutes. Like I don't really care about this. So, and what I really dug into with the help of my teachers was that I was attracted to what certain technologies or tools or resources allowed someone to do, not the tool itself, but rather the sort of, for lack of a better phrase, democratization of understanding and knowledge, that you could manipulate a resource or use a resource to learn with it. And you didn't need to rely on an individual standing up in front of a classroom telling you things, the old, what Freire called banking model of education. And so I realized that was where it was at for me, was like that. And so I started digging into sort of that idea of democracy in education, and, read what I think a lot of people in education do early on, like John Dewey, and was really interested in kind of the social reconstructivist movement of the 1930s. And then it eventually sort of came into this as more of a, not just like a democratization of knowledge, although I do like the idea of like teachers doing research in their own setting that produces understanding and knowledge about their own practice. It's more for me about how do we navigate difficulties and challenges in classroom spaces when certain conversations emerge or certain content comes up. How do we recognize the potential negative impacts and effects of implicit curriculum? And all of that became kind of the focus for me. The foundation for like where I went from there was really my dissertation about the early career teachers' beliefs about democracy and where those came from and how they shaped their teaching. And it really struck me as interesting. I mean, the one thing that was sort of not surprising but interesting about it was that all three of the teachers really felt like their commitments to certain concepts like rights, equality, inequity, freedom, those concepts were like very much tied to their childhood. So they feel like they learned them very early on, and they usually learned them from a specific person, like their grandma or grandpa, and it was just a really fascinating thing to me. And so I became really interested in that. Like, how does freedom get conflated in an economic system based on capitalism and a profit motive, while it's also a political social system that's supposed to be based on people having power and authority? And so that kind of tension is what really drew me into teaching social studies in the ways that I value now.
So much of what you just said, Andy, it resonates so much with just like how our program goes down and how we learn about a program. For those interested in taking,
I see you smiling as I'm talking, and I'm like, oh, he's starting to realize like why we're doing certain things. Like
the syllabus is all coming together, basically.
Yeah, right,
it's all
right.
starting to make sense from your end of things. And so for people interested in taking human geography, what you just said about the democratic creation of knowledge, that class has to be the most anti-banking model class that I've ever taken. We construct knowledge so much as a group and so much through using those tools that you talked about. And that was fascinating. And honestly, I'm now seeing that everything you're doing is just modeling for us that you want us to do as we're teachers, which is a really cool thing to realize. And that's pretty congruent throughout Peabody. One of the areas of research that you have done some work in, but also have taught us a decent amount about, that I thought would be neat to highlight, is counter narratives. Just tell us about counter narratives. How did you kind of learn about this idea, and why is it so important in social studies teachers to learn about?
Yeah, so the idea of counter narrative in history, I think, is important and meaningful because history education. So I remember doing this small interview study with a mentor of mine. We were co-teaching a teaching methods class for science and social studies pre-service teachers. And what was fascinating to me is we were doing these interviews before the class even started to get a sense of what the pre-service teachers thought of their subject area and what they thought happened in the other subject area. So essentially what we were asking the pre-service science teachers is, what do you think science is? Like, what does it mean to do science? And then we were asking them, those same people, and what do you think it means to do history? What's history learning look like? And then we did the same with the future history teachers. And what was interesting to me is, the science teachers, when we asked them, they said, oh, science is about asking questions and gathering data and information and analyzing and doing research and sharing information and knowledge and research outcomes, you know. And we said, well, what's history? And they said, history is just like a bunch of facts, and you write a bunch of stuff down because someone tells it to you when you're sitting in your chair. And then we asked the history teachers, you know, what is science and so history about? And they said, oh, history, it's about asking questions and finding data and information and doing research and communicating ideas. And we said, well, what's science about? And they said, oh, it's about information and facts and writing things down that your teacher tells you. And so like, there were just these like very, I don't know what the word is, but these sort of limited understandings of the other subject area, while they saw their own subject area very much as an inquiry-oriented endeavor. And so I think that really struck me early on as like, yeah, each subject area is unique and also not that unique. I mean, in terms of the kinds of practices we might want to see happening, asking questions, for lack of a better phrase, student-centered sorts of learning opportunities. We want students to build agency in the classroom. Like there are things that cut across subject areas. But that said, in history, there is a tendency, I think, in more traditional settings for, you know, you walk into a classroom, you might see an outline on a board, desks of rows, students facing forward, a teacher up front telling a narrative, and students writing down that narrative. We refer to that in our space learning and mobility lab work with local teachers and students as a monovocal narrative. Meaning it's one perspective, one version of the story. And there was a really interesting question that was sent in before the faculty FaceTime about sort of the role of counter-narrative in social studies, specifically in history, and how do you sort of teach that without positioning it simply as like an alternative perspective or something along those lines. And I think that's a good question. I think the idea with counter narratives is that they could contradict the broader, or what we might think of as like the dominant narrative that gets told, but they don't have to. What counter narrative could be is, for example, oral history, firsthand accounts could be thought of as counter narrative. And so, you know, I know Vanderbilt digital archival work around Who Speaks for the Negro with Robert Penn Warren's collection of interviews is a great example, I think, of how you could build counter narrative into a typically taught history unit on the American Civil Rights Movement. So the American Civil Rights Movement gets taught in US history classrooms, usually around 9th or 10th grade across the country. And that narrative is pretty monovocal in terms of the way it's communicated. And it's often limited in terms of the ways history gets understood around the civil rights movement. So ideas like nonviolent protest being the highly valued way of protesting during the American Civil Rights Movement, the way that gets taken up could lead to inadequate understandings by students that somehow that was the only form of protest that happened. Because we're not identifying people like Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X and talking more in depth about their beliefs or their approach to change in society. You know, there's a really great example of in the interview that was done with Eliza Blades and Stokely Carmichael and students from Greensboro. The first minute and a half or 2 minutes is amazing. It is all about how the Greensboro sit-ins started. And I play it in most of the classes I teach when I have the chance to, because the way that we learn about the sit-in movement in textbooks in history classrooms is very brief, and it's very much like, you know, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organized these, people were trained, they went in, they sat down, there were backups. So when that group got arrested, another group came in and sat down, like very coordinated, very organized. And the way that this story gets communicated from the perspective of Eliza Blades is like, no, a buddy of mine, they're college students. And he basically says, a buddy of mine went to get a sandwich at a lunch counter at the bus station, they wouldn't serve him. So he suggested we all go in and sit down there until we get served or they arrest us. And a couple days goes by, and him and his friends are sitting in their dorm room, and the guy comes in and says, "Hey, are you guys ready? Let's go." And he says, "Oh no, we thought we were kidding. We weren't serious about it." And then he said, this guy Frank, who's one of the bigger guys, says, "What are you all, chicken or something?" And for me, I was like, no, that's a story I can relate to. Like being a 20-year-old person in a dorm room and someone calling me chicken to get me to go do something. That's a story that positions me as like, well, that could have happened to me. Like I could have been in a room and maybe participated in a protest or an event or something like that, rather than positioning historical actors as sort of these unattainable figures. It becomes more of an agency building sort of feature through counter narrative. And so that's just like one example of the potential, I think, of counter narrative. It's not that we're trying to necessarily position counter narrative as 100% all the time contradicting a dominant narrative, but rather we can use it to leverage students' sense of agency as a potential historical actor in a story, in a community. Yeah.
And what's so neat about all that is how a lot of the things that you use counter narratives with in regards to like spatial thinking, civic engagement, kind of bringing community assets, a lot of these things weave together both inside the classroom and how you're teaching us to teach our students history, but also I think it's interesting how much this can be applied to outside of school learning. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what can a lot of these modes of thought contribute to outside of a history classroom, and where does that present itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I am where I am right now. I mean, not literally, not like metaphorically about my life, but I mean, I am in a coffee shop attached to the Omni at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum because I'm teaching a class right now called Learning Out of School for the Learning and Design program. And this Learning Out of School class this week has been an exploration of museum learning. And so we've been to the Tennessee State Museum, the National Museum of African American Music, and the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum, and got to talk to educators and people there. And so I love teaching this class. I feel like my sort of professional identity is kind of 1 foot in schools and 1 foot out of schools, because I realize that lots of learning happens outside of school. Very meaningful learning happens outside of school. And there's just certain things schools have a hard time doing. It's very difficult in schools to do. One of the things that we got to do last week was to go to the Oasis Center. And the Oasis Center has a lot of wonderful programs, but one of the most amazing to me is Dan Furbish's bike workshop there. And the bike workshop, I had no idea how many bikes they have. They took us into their storage room. It is amazing. I didn't know this, but like there are lots of bikes, for example, left on campus at the end of the academic year for Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt donates those bikes if no one comes and gets them or claims them. And so that's just one place that donates bikes, but it's such a well-known program in the community. They have so many bikes that if a young person signs up for this bike workshop, they get partnered with an adult mentor. They get a bike, they get a toolkit and a helmet, and they go through the process of completely deconstructing the bike down to its frame. Then they rebuild the bike with new parts. And so now they know how to repair the bike, how to fix the bike if it breaks, and then they get the bike. They do a safety ride, and then they get the bike, and they become more mobile. And so one concept that we messed with a little bit in human geography is counter mobility. So a form of sort of embodied counter narrative, like how do you move through a place in a way that maybe runs counter to the intended ways you would move through a place. For example, the built environment tends to have an intended use. Like a parking lot is intended for parking vehicles, but people might skateboard there. And if they're skateboarding, that could be seen as a form of counter mobility if they're skateboarding in a place where that wasn't intended. And so I like Katie Taylor's work on this. She was a PhD student, is now associate professor at University of Washington. And she worked very closely with Dan Furbish on her dissertation work, and the young people and the bike workshop. This is another way that this could be thought of as counter. Is she was thinking about how their mobility changed before and after the bike, and so to do that, sort of get at it, she asked them to draw a map from memory, draw a map of their neighborhood, and most of the maps were, like, this is my house. I know where my house is, and then I know there's a park in my neighborhood, so I'm gonna draw like a baseball field here. And then I think there's a couple houses between my house and the park, so I'm gonna draw a couple houses that I don't. But that was kind of the extent of the detail. Like, the young people just didn't know what was even on their street, because they would have had to walk or whatever to get there, and they just didn't walk that far. Once they got a bike, they were able to have their bike for a few weeks. She asked them to redraw the map, and it was far more detailed. Like, they knew that park inside and out because they started riding their bike there. They knew how many houses were between the park and their house. And so I think that is a form of counter mobility, empowering people with the agency to move themselves from one place to another, is a form of sort of democratizing mobility and thinking about how young people might get to know their community and get to know the space that they live in differently.
What I'm thinking about is, a couple months ago, you and I sat down and I asked you a few questions, and then your response was the question of, with everything that I've taught you in these classes, how are you experiencing the world differently now that I've began to see examples of how counter narratives shape society or don't shape society, or how counter mobility can influence people's access and agency. For students that are going to take your classes, whether it's literacies or it's human geography or engaging in any of the programs that you're associated with, what is a goal that you have? And I feel like I'm somewhat of a testament to this, for students to change how they view the world or how they interact with the world, even just on a civic level.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I don't have necessarily a clear goal for students myself, except that I hope they'll find out what they're passionate about and feel empowered and have the agency to pursue that. I do think it's interesting. I mean, I was talking to, this kind of speaks to another question that was sent in, but I was talking to someone, a student yesterday, about a class that she's building, and she was trying to figure out. Well, first, let me back up. So in the introduction, the generous introduction that I got as I joined here, the word citizenship was mentioned, and in the field of social studies education, learning is referred to as citizenship education if it is for the purpose of engaging in a community, engaging civically, those sorts of things. We now, I think, find that phrasing problematic and exclusionary, in particular for students from immigrant and refugee backgrounds, or students that maybe don't have not or will not experience citizenship in terms of naturalization. But what I do think I have commitments to, for sure, is sort of each person thinking about their role in their community and being able to identify the pathways for engagement that are meaningful to them. And so, find out what you care about and find ways to make change. I love Rich Milner's book titled, after an African proverb, "Start where you are, but don't stay there." I think is just a wonderful read and a great book. We've used it in our classroom ecology course about designing classroom environments. And I think that idea as a sort of guidepost is aligned with sort of the goal for our students coming to our programs, that you're coming with some ideas in mind, start there, but don't stay there. Like, you need to be learning and thinking and changing and growing and figuring out what you care about, what your commitments are, and hopefully the experiences, not just in classrooms and at the university, but with student organizations, with opportunities like this, with sort of the learning out of school spaces that happen for students at Vanderbilt. Hopefully that becomes more authentic for them and more of a reality, right?
What you just said about Dr. Milner, one of the things that struck me about this program, and I know we definitely want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but is how centralized and how the experience at Peabody, it's different professors teaching different things, but the program itself seems very cohesive and aligned. Even though these fields of research and the things being taught are so different, sort of what does that say about Peabody? Where does that come from? Why is that important? I know it's been important in my own walk very much in this program to see that. Well, the thing that really struck me is that it doesn't feel like Peabody tries to indoctrinate or tell its students what to think. Essentially, what you've done is just presented me with a bunch of research and a bunch of data, and then let me find out my own opinions on a lot of these matters. And it feels like most of Peabody operates like this in the classes that I've taken. Can you say anything to that or that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can speak for my colleagues, but I would say, and Hasina, you should chime in here too. I mean, I think there has been over the years a concerted effort and we don't always get it right, but at a concerted effort at every sort of level, institutionally and individually in our own teaching, to try to attend to issues of equity and in real ways. And so, everything from the syllabus and who you're reading to our, dean's office structure is paying attention to issues of equity and inclusion. And when mistakes get made or missteps happen, I think in my experience, those get addressed in an explicit way rather than swept under a rug or covered up, which is something I think I'm happy about here. Does anyone have anything else they want to add about that?
I love that you feel that way, Will. That's a great, testament. And I do think our faculty are amazing and really thoughtful and intentional about the ways that they present information and how that works across different programs and different departments. And I love that, I was an HOD person myself, but that I was able to take classes in teaching and learning and other departments and have it be really relevant to the things that I was interested in and cared about. So I do think that there isn't an ethos, I guess, of equity and inclusion across Peabody, across departments. And it does come out in the fact that you could take classes across the college and have it really align with what your interests are, even if it's in a different discipline. So open it up for other thoughts as well.
Yeah, those are great points. And I'm just thinking a little bit, hearing you talk about that, Will, makes me think maybe you thought there was a meeting of your professors to decide what our philosophy is going to be, but I don't think it's that strategic, although I love that it maybe feels that way. But I do think there are some underpinnings and commitments that are somewhat shared among the faculty, and when you take classes with faculty members with those shared commitments, and then you're going to experience kind of what you have, I think. And I don't know that your experience is indicative of everyone's, but yeah, I think that's an important feature, especially when preparing people to go into schools. Schools, I'm thinking of the book By Design, and schools. One view of schools is that they're doing exactly what they were designed to do in terms of being inequitable and exclusionary and discriminatory. And so, we I think want people. I know you said you don't feel like you've been indoctrinated, but our students I know go into schools and they're told by teachers or other people there that they've drank the Peabody Kool-Aid, you know, and that's not the real world. And I guess my response would be, yeah, we know that's not the real world. That's why we're teaching this, because we hope that we can change the world. We hope that this speaks to sort of your question about the goals for students, I guess, is I hope you all will go out and do better. You know, you'll teach kids better. You'll push for equity better. You'll make change in the schools somehow. You'll become leaders, not just teachers. And that's, I think, what we are hoping for.
That's so powerful. And I was just thinking about my own journey through this program and how differently I walked into this program and where my mind and my ideologies surrounding education are now, and sort of how that transpired. We can use this, we don't have to, but is there any questions you had for me about sort of my progress through this, or how you expected me to gain one thing from your classes that I might have just gotten something completely different? Almost like a case study of a student in this program.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are lots of examples of this, but you even in this conversation, you mentioned the human geography class as like an example of building knowledge together. That was not really anything I wasn't thinking to myself, I'm going to make this human geography class like a social construction of knowledge experience for students. I wasn't thinking about that at all. In fact, I was more worried about, like, is the technology going to work or break during this class? And so to me, it felt almost like I was doing too much direction there. But I'm really happy that it felt that way to you, that like, wow, yeah, we really constructed knowledge here. And part of that is, I think, as a teacher, I just have sort of I try really hard to pull back from just giving the answer. So, you know, even I know there was a question about, you know, what should we read before the human geography class to be prepared for it? And I guess my answer is nothing. I mean, if you really want to look up some stuff on space and place, you should do that. But like, I actually think it works better. That class is just kind of supposed to be messing around in a content area that most people aren't super familiar with. We don't have a geography department at Vanderbilt. And it was a required experience for teacher licensure by the state of Tennessee. And so we kind of built this class as a program, and we're like, well, let's just explore issues using maps. And that was what we were going to do. And it turned into sort of using technology tools. And we now incorporate computer-based modeling with some help from other faculty members who are experts in that area, and do some coding work. And so there's like, it sort of has taken on a life of its own in terms of the way it's evolved a little bit. But yeah, I think in my mind, I was like, wow, I always finish that class feeling like I love that class. And I feel like I told people too much like stuff. And I feel like it's great that that wasn't your takeaway.
It was not at all. It's so interesting that you felt like that. And you're talking about the coding work, and I'm just having flashbacks of the time I spent that, without giving too much away for the future students. But what was so neat about human geography is how cross-disciplinary it felt, and how I feel like it engaged geography, but you're also applying levels of like philosophy and ethics and social studies and history, overlying all these things just to study people and how injustices have presented themselves, and sort of how to think about the world differently because of that. And that sense of cross-disciplinary has just really portrayed a lot of my time here at Peabody. I think it's pretty neat that, thinking about it as sort of a cross-disciplinary program, Dr. Hostetler is actually pretty soon going to be stepping into the role of director of the learning design program. Thinking about a lot about learning that occurs outside of school, thinking about community organizations, service organizations, and how these things all play into each other. I was wondering if you could say anything to any of that.
Yeah, one of my favorite projects that I got the chance to work on, I was invited by Rogers Hall to be a part of the Space Learning and Mobility Lab here and work with them. And we had a grant called BLUES, Bridging Learning in Urban Spaces. And the idea was we were going to see if we could work with learners, people, young people especially, to build basically map-based spatial stories of neighborhood history so that they could be walkable. So you could actually like go out of the school and go to the places where history happened. And we worked very closely with Lorenzo Washington, who is the president, CEO, docent, owner, operator, curator of the grassroots museum called Jefferson Street Sound Office and Museum over on 21st and Jefferson Street. They're open on Saturdays from 11 to 4. You should go. But it's great because it captures the history of music and blues on Jefferson Street from basically the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And there's so much that the young people we worked with learned about their neighborhood. It was just one of the most meaningful. I remember a student turning to his teacher because of testing and school structures, we didn't work with them until May, 2 weeks before school was going to be out. And you haven't lived until you've worked with 11th graders right before summer break after their exams and tried to get them to do something that feels academic in some way. So we're there and we're working with these young people to build these stories about athletics, music, political engagement in North Nashville in the 1950s and 60s. And we're walking down the street and somehow a student points out that he read in one of the materials he was working with that Jimi Hendrix lived in an apartment above this salon. And then it came up, he basically looked at his teacher and said, now why haven't we learned about this before? Like I've learned about George Washington 4 times and I have never learned that Jimi Hendrix lived here, or that in his case, his uncle Jimmy is Jimmy Church, who is a famous blues musician and played in the same clubs as Ray Charles and Ike and Tina Turner. And so, like that kind of learning is agency building for students and for young people, for anyone, to sort of make those discoveries about their neighborhood and how all the amazing things that happened near them with people who they might even know or be related to, or even just like it's a place they pass by on the bus. Like now they know something about this place that they didn't know before, and it completely changes it for them. Is a more humanizing endeavor than sitting in a classroom with a textbook and sort of reading a very monovocal narrative or being told a very monovocal narrative. So I don't know if I think that answers your question. Yeah.
Absolutely. What you just said summarizes my time in this program so well. And just thinking about how to think about the world differently in a humanizing nature. That was the majority of questions that I had for you. I wanted to ask if you had anything else that you wanted to highlight, any questions you had for me, or if the audience had any questions, however you want to go about the rest of this time.
We have 15 minutes left. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we'd love to hear people's thoughts and ideas. So much of what you said resonated with me. And it's funny because I never had human geography when I was in school way back when, but all 3 of my kids went through it. And it was so interesting at how different they reacted to it compared to their other history classes. Like it was much more like, oh, this is something that is useful information for me. So I love kind of this idea that there's a space for young people to learn history that's really engaging in a different way.
Yeah, and in terms of the program that Will's in secondary education for social studies, that class is meant to be the sort of unstructured experience, exploring history, exploring issues, relevant issues in politics. And then there's another class that they take called literacies in social studies. And that's more about like, what does a historian do? And how do we do some of that with young people in schools? And so those kind of juxtaposed to each other, it's like 2 very different, almost epistemic views of how learning and knowledge ought to be happening in social spaces. And so the more recent work that I've been doing is more about like when difficult conversations emerge in a classroom, what do teachers see as difficult and how do they navigate those? And I'd be interested to know from Will, like especially the current political context. The state of Tennessee and lots of other states have passed policies dictating to teachers kind of what they can and can't teach. Some of those laws are built around what they call anti-critical race theory curriculum, and other laws and rules are built around notification policies when someone is about to teach something related to LGBTQ issues or experience or history. So, like, I guess, Will, I'd want to know from you, like, what's your take so far in your learning at Peabody about those kinds of professional challenges that you're bound to face when you graduate, and anything else that you might want to share related to that? Is that something you're worried about? Is it something you think about? How do you imagine, are you feeling increasingly prepared to encounter those kinds of challenges? I'm just interested in that.
I remember you telling us that some of these challenges might pop up in our classes and in our time working with policy. And some of my classmates were kind of baffled that we could ever be told what we can and can't teach. And then your answer was, it's not if it happens, it's when it happens, and it's how you're going to respond to that. And I thought that was so interesting. Dr. Barry is another professor in the social studies program who uses the term wedging a decent amount, and thinking about where in our curriculums, if we are told what we can and can't teach, how can we, not subversively, but how can we work with what we are given and still apply a humanizing lens to the curriculum that we're working with? How can we include alternative texts that might display some counter narratives or some alternate modes of thinking on a historical subject? And it's really sad that a lot of these policies are going to impact so much of what I personally am able to teach or not teach. But part of me, my goal is just to figure out how I can work with what I'm given to include curriculum and have students, talking about agency, build their own learning in a way that doesn't just prescribe to one sort of set of teaching. Yeah, I think that's majority of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, and schools are different. I mean, as much as they might look the same, different leadership, different districts are going to have, they're sort of going to take up these issues a little bit differently. Yeah. And so I think, my advice to teachers coming out of our program is to, when you're interviewing, it's not just them interviewing you, you are interviewing them as well. And you want to make sure you go to a place that is going to value and support the kind of ways of thinking or ways of teaching that that are meaningful to you. I don't think that means that everyone has to go to a school that already has commitments to equity. I think it's great if the Wills of the world go to schools and make change, but there is sort of that question about the current political context and policy context in teaching, and how does the school respond when teachers are, if someone from home comes in about something a student was learning in the classroom, what's the process? Like, that's the kind of question I would be asking if I was looking for jobs at schools right now.
And to echo that, something that another faculty member, Dr. Bennett, was telling me about is called the social discipline window. Exactly what Andy's talking about, and thinking about, as I'm looking at schools to begin working at, where is the sort of juxtaposition of where there's an opportunity to think about some equity work there, and the level of support on the other axis that I'll be given in this, and really thinking about like how to optimize the work is something that Andy's asked me to think about a decent amount. How to optimize sort of the time that I have in the classroom with the constituents in place. And that's really meant a lot, because I'm starting to think about what schools I'll try to work at following the end of this program, and where is the work needed, and it's needed everywhere, but where can I apply a lot of that work has really been something I'm thinking about.
I also just shared someone, there's in the chat, people are talking about the Jefferson Street Sound Office, and there is a virtual museum visit link. One of the things we were able to do was to make a gigapan. A gigapan is like thousands of pictures stitched together. So you can make that image full screen, and you can zoom in so that you can read very small text. So if you don't have a chance to get there, you can at least see the main gallery space that way. But I do appreciate your response, Will. I think, you know, often I try to talk with people who are teachers in schools, and maybe their frustrations are growing with the ways things are going, and talk to them about, you know, well, what are the things you can do to help yourself stay rejuvenated? What can you do to help yourself feel connected? And you know, we often have people come back and stay a part of our program as reviewers for capstones or for screenings, or you know, I'll send things like, I just sent the virtual museum visit and tell them to go to Jefferson Street Sound. Like, that'll rejuvenate you if you just go talk to Lorenzo and hear him talk about his work to preserve cultural heritage along Jefferson Street, and the next generation of people coming up and that sort of thing. So yeah, but I think that's all important stuff, Will.
I did have a little bit of a follow-up question. And hi, I'm Eliza Blades. I'm with the Office of Student Engagement and Wellbeing. It's good to see y'all. And, you know, I really appreciate this discourse of, you know, how do we navigate within the classroom these particular points of tension? And I wonder, outside of the classroom, like I would be really interested to see, have you encountered examples of when you've had young people learn difficult things about their community? For example, you know, this used to be this particular sacred or important part of our neighborhood, but now it's gone, and we've learned why. And yeah, what does that mean, and how does that transcend into how they make sense of who they are and what their neighborhood means to them, and the value and agency that they feel that they have within it?
That is such a good question. And yes, we have encountered that. I will say there's a couple critiques of this idea of like local history being meaningful. One is, does it create sort of inequitable access because it's maybe more impactful for students who have a longer history in that neighborhood? So students who have moved into that neighborhood aren't getting the same kind of meaningful agency building experience. And that's definitely something to attend to. The other question is exactly what you're proposing, which is that inevitably students are likely to learn something about their neighborhood that is not something that pleasant, or that is something difficult historically. And so, you know, I think that teaching, there's some great work by Sarah Levy, Levy, on teaching difficult history. And she specifically uses sort of the teaching of the Holocaust as an example, a case to talk through. But I think some of the ideas are relevant to when you encounter a difficult history in your own neighborhood or in your community in some ways. And that is to, you know, you don't have to hide it or shy away from it, but I think engaging in a process of contextualizing it is helpful. Understanding the why, while it seems like it might be hard or difficult, that understanding is better than confusion or unknown. So, you know, in my experience, as well as in some of the work on this, it seems like, for example, even in terms of avoiding discussions in classrooms, Diana Hess has some work on this, and Brookfield and Fresco, and there's some research on avoiding discussions in general, not just difficult discussions or difficult histories, but just the idea of letting students talk to each other. Teachers and educators want to have sort of control in a lot of ways. because they're worried someone's going to say something wrong or inappropriate or offensive or whatever. And that is sort of a real fear, but it's also an unknown, unfounded sort of concern. And so that unknown causes more anxiety about discussions than the actual discussion would. And so I think like getting through that, to confront the hard histories, to do it with support for students, to engage in the conversations, to allow the discussion to happen, while it might feel a little uncomfortable, is nowhere near as anxious and anxiety inducing as if you avoid it and keep away from it. And so I think that's a hard challenge to get through for some people, but I think it's an important one to recognize. And I also do this, like, I mean, I think a great way to practice is like in your own life. Like, you know, when you go to a family member's home for dinner or whatever, ask them a challenging question and see what they say, you know, and see how they respond, and practice your responses, you know, and facial expressions. You know, I'm a kind of person, I think people kind of read my face pretty well. I don't know if I can't hide what I'm thinking, but I think that that's an important thing to do, is to like work on that ourselves. How are we communicating about ideas with people? And I love this James Baldwin quote in terms of thinking about a threshold for what, like, I personally am willing to tolerate or accept in terms of a discourse or a communication of an idea. There's a wonderful James Baldwin quote, and I'm going to look at it so that I don't mess it up, but it's, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And now, of course, he's speaking as a Black man, but I have almost every identity indicator of a privileged person. But I think that as someone who sees themselves as an ally to those who might be part of historically marginalized communities, I think it's important for me to know when to step in and say something as well. And so I try to look for that. Like, is what you're saying grounded in a dehumanizing way of thinking? And if so, then I might challenge that. If it's rooted in someone's oppression, then I would say that that's my threshold for stepping in and like challenging it and saying that's wrong. But otherwise, we can talk about all sorts of things, politics and other things. But anyway, I see that we're at 12:59 p.m. And so
What great
pacing,
questions. Yeah. Thank you both for being here, Andy and Will, and thank you guys all for joining us. This was a great conversation, and I think a lot of food for thought, a lot of things that I want to think about and explore, including that link you shared. That sounds great. Yeah. We'll have to do that. And I don't know if anybody has any last thoughts, but thank you again for being here, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks, Will.